War is back in the Middle East, and the biggest question on people's minds in India and globally, what happens next? How was the Hamas able to stage such an attack? To what extent will the Israelis go in their counter-offensive? Could this war now escalate? To talk about this and more, I'm joined on India Today live and exclusive at this time by one of the world's leading risk gurus. Joining us is Ian Bremmer, American political scientist, author, entrepreneur, founder, president of the Eurasia Group, and really one of the world's top experts on risk. Thank you very much, Ian, for joining us. I want you to start by explaining to our viewers, as best as you understand, how the Hamas was able to pull off an attack of this magnitude against one of the most sophisticated armed forces in the world, which has an intelligence service which is the envy of other countries. How could Hamas stage this attack? Why couldn't the Israelis stop it?
It's true. When you talk about Israel, not just their intelligence, their surveillance capabilities, their human capabilities on the ground in the occupied territories, also their border security, really it's considered the gold standard. But the Israelis took their eye off the ball. For the last 6 months, Israel has been consumed in a constitutional crisis. No one's been talking about the concerns of the Palestinians, certainly not in Gaza, certainly not Hamas. Instead, it was massive internal demonstrations, which included many members of the Israeli Defense Forces, some of whom said they wouldn't actually serve if the judicial reforms went ahead. Also, Prime Minister Netanyahu was himself focused on expanding settlements in the West Bank. And indeed, many battalions of the Defense Forces were sent to the West Bank and to the surrounding border areas, in part to help ensure stability given those settlements, and also to deal with the sometimes violent reprisals, demonstrations, attacks that had come from Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. In other words, there was very little focus on Gaza and Hamas. There was a feeling of confidence, even in the days before the attacks, from Israel's defense leaders that there was no war being planned, that Palestinians and Hamas were bottled up. This was not a priority. This was not a concern. Now, that combined with clearly an extraordinary amount of training on the part of these Hamas militants. This was something I would say they probably would have been planning for years, not just months. Those things combined really lead to unprecedented tragedy for the Israeli people.
Because some of these videos have actually been geolocated by our open source intelligence experts and others to areas just about 50 kilometers from the Israel border. So it's not as if they were out in a place where they couldn't be seen. Given the kind of capacity Israel has, it almost seems as if this is one of the biggest intelligence failures in decades that Israel has to deal with.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that, again, the presumption of the Israeli government was that the Palestinian issue didn't really matter. No one was focusing on a two-state solution. No one was focusing on negotiations. Netanyahu and his far-right coalition partners, their view was the Palestinians are no longer a fundamental threat. The Israelis have basically won. So indeed, they could take more territory for an expanding Israeli population in the West Bank. And the conditions for Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, were becoming worse and worse and worse. 50% absolute poverty, some 70% without access even to clean water. And in this environment, the necessity of the Israelis to be absolutely focused on national security, on the borders, on intelligence collection, you'd think that would be even more essential. But of course, Israel has been just consumed with domestic challenges to their own democracy. So really, this is a case of a very sophisticated and well-resourced Israeli defense capability that has taken its eye off the ball. And certainly Prime Minister Netanyahu, his legacy now will be these attacks, the Hamas attacks.
The Israel Defense Forces have said that there will be a war with Hamas. What form and shape do you see that war take? We're already seeing heavy aerial fire, the Air Force artillery mortars being used. So far, Israel has held back from a ground offensive, because that would cause a lot of devastation in the Gaza Strip, also death to Israeli armed personnel. Do you now think that is inevitable? And if there is a ground invasion, how is that likely to go?
I do think it's inevitable, but there are a few other things that are going on. You also have a siege that was announced a few hours ago by the Israeli defense minister. No more gas, no more food, no more water, nothing getting into Gaza going forward. Already a crippling poor territory. Remember, some 2.2 million Palestinians actually live in Gaza. You also have well over 100, possibly as many as 160, 170, I'm hearing, hostages that have been taken, Israeli civilian hostages that are in Gaza. And certainly the top priority for the Israeli Defense Forces right now will be to secure those hostages and get them back safely. That's an incredibly difficult thing to do. But beyond that, there will be ground strikes. There will be house-to-house warfare. There will be an effort by the Israelis to remove Hamas leadership, to kill them, to capture them, also to disarm Hamas militants. And that probably means a fairly long occupation, a very bloody occupation, one that will lead to enormous casualties for the Palestinians on the ground. The big question is whether this war expands beyond Israel and Gaza to include the West Bank and also to include other countries. That has not
So I'll come to that in just a moment. I want to stick for a moment just to the attack. Do you think, how much time do you think it might take for the IDF to be able to establish control on the Gaza Strip, given that it's a hostile population, many of whom will fight back? It's densely populated, and it won't be easy for Israel to occupy that area by force.
No. I mean, they're not going to establish full control. There's always going to be an insurgency. The question is, how much do the Israelis want to have a destruction of Hamas leadership as a singular goal, and how much do they want to ensure greater levels of direct occupation? I mean, I don't think they've made this decision yet, and perhaps they won't make the decision until they see how the military operations proceed. But certainly on the table as a potential outcome would be a permanent occupation of Gaza. I think that right now the Israelis are in trauma. They're shocked. I suspect that they're making more tactical decisions than they are thinking about what they're going to be facing in 3 months' time.
Let's now come to the question of escalation. We've seen some mortar firing by the Hezbollah, which saw Israeli artillery counteroffensive. Is the Hezbollah likely to get involved? Do you see this potentially spread even further to involve Iran?
So far, Hezbollah has been very cautious. Of course, the political statements completely support Hamas. But as you said, only some rocket attacks against a military facility, which the IDF responded to. That's it. So clearly right now, Hezbollah is saying this is Hamas's fight. Iran is saying they had nothing to do with it. They're saying this is Hamas's fight. Now, of course, Iran has been very publicly supportive of Hamas. Iran has provided military support for Hamas historically. But the United States government has said, as of a few hours ago, that there is no evidence, no hard evidence that the Iranians are directly involved. So clearly the Americans are telling the Israelis for now that there is no justification for escalating this war into Iran. The Americans also sending a fleet to the region to show Israel that the Americans have their back. So it's a warning to the Iranians, but it's also a warning to the Israelis. And I just, as of right now, there's pressure not to allow this war to escalate beyond Israel and Gaza.
The Saudis and the Israelis were working towards some kind of diplomatic engagement, talking about a potential deal. Is that deal now dead?
That deal is now dead. The Saudis demanded some level of support for the Palestinians in order to come to an agreement with the Israelis. This is the opposite of that, clearly. There's no way the Saudis would be able to come to this agreement. You're going to see big demonstrations on the Arab street against Israel as a consequence of this. There's been very little of that over the last few years. This will now become an urgent issue, and it will constrain the Saudis from making that deal. It will constrain the UAE and other countries that are working with Israel from getting closer to Israel. And the Saudis, I was speaking to Saudi officials even a week ago. They were quite optimistic that we were heading towards a deal in the coming months. That's now off the table.
So is it temporarily dead, buried, or permanently dead in your view?
Permanently is a long time. You know, the leadership of these countries, the Gulf states, have lots of reasons they'd like to cooperate with Israel. There are technological reasons, there are national security reasons, there are economic investment reasons. Those don't change overnight. But the political realities on the ground for these countries make this deal dead for the foreseeable future.
Given the disproportionate response from Israel, which is inevitable, what do you make of the timing of Hamas's strike? Obviously, everyone going into this attack knew that they'd be dead, that there would be very severe consequences, including on the civilian population. Why did Hamas choose this manner of attack and this magnitude of attack?
Well, I mean, the symbolism of the 50th anniversary of the 1973 war certainly is resonant, and I suspect that played into the decision-making to a degree. But more broadly, it's because Israel was in such a strong geopolitical position. It's because the friends of the Palestinians were leaving them behind. They were moving on to start working with Israel. They were living their own lives. And the Israeli government was a hard right-wing Israeli government, did not feel any pressure to deal with the Palestinian issue. In fact, they were only taking more settlements, taking more land that belongs to the Palestinians. It was a policy of subjugation, and the Americans and the Europeans were pushing Netanyahu to stop doing that. Netanyahu wasn't listening. So Hamas, which is an organization unlike the Palestinian Authority, which consistently calls for the utter destruction of Israel. Well, I mean, they weren't moving with the UAE or the Saudis. They weren't finding a way to do more with less. They were feeling increasingly isolated. So I do believe that there was a level of desperation on the part of Hamas that felt like they were losing on every front, losing in the Middle East, losing with the Israelis. And as a consequence, when you are in a corner, you're more likely to act irrationally. And I think that's precisely what Hamas's leadership has just done.
There are conspiracy theorists who think that because Benjamin Netanyahu wasn't the kind of domestic political trouble that he was, that he chose to look the other way so that the Hamas could pull off an attack of this magnitude, then he'd be able to get the domestic population to rally around the Israeli flag. How do you respond to or look at these conspiracy theories that say the reason for the incompetence is not actual incompetence, because we know that's not true, is because they chose to look the other way because they wanted something around which the Israeli people could coalesce?
I would say even addressing them on your show does a disservice to the program, and it's not worth airing them, frankly.
Sure, because nobody under any circumstances would want something like this to happen. But how is this likely to impact the political graph of Benjamin Netanyahu? There is talk about different political parties coming together and forming a unity consensus government around the issue of national security. And there are right-wing elements, extreme right-wing elements, who are part of the Netanyahu coalition. The other parties want them to break away. Will Netanyahu do that, according to you?
I think that there is likely to be a national emergency government to respond to this war effort, and that Benny Gantz, former defense minister, prime minister, is likely to join, perhaps Yair Lapid, the leader of the opposition. This certainly will bring all Israel together for the foreseeable future, with national security as the top priority, more important than the economy, more important than the constitutional crisis, which had been fomented by Netanyahu the past weeks and months. But this doesn't make life easier for Netanyahu long term. Let's be very clear. This happened on his watch. He's the one that is, responsible ultimately for the national security of the Israeli people, and he failed the Israeli people. And that's one of the reasons why a unity government is essential, to create the legitimacy for the war that is now going on, for the atrocities that will certainly be committed as a consequence of that. The Israeli people need to be fully together for what is going to be an existential fight for themselves. I mean, let's be clear. these are the worst atrocities that have been committed against Jews in the world since the Holocaust. And for a country of 10 million surrounded by enemies, this is something that the entire country will rally together in a way that is almost unimaginable for any other country on the planet.
Two last questions. 9/11 changed America. How is Israel likely to change on the back of what has been called Israel's 9/11?
Yeah, I referred to it as Israel's 9/11 immediately after it happened. Of course, it is that dramatic. But of course, the United States overreacted for 9/11, overreacted on the ground in ways that made it harder for the U.S. to function as a transparent representative democracy, stripped away a lot of people's rights. Also overreacted internationally in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that cost trillions of dollars, and more important, millions and millions of lives destroyed as a consequence of that, still being felt more than 20 years after. One would hope that Netanyahu and a unity government, assuming we see that, will learn some of the lessons that the Americans did not from the war on terror.
What does this attack mean for the Palestinian cause? There hasn't been much negotiation, dialogue, diplomacy between the Israelis and the Palestinians of late. Does this resurrect the idea of a two-nation solution, or do you think that's already dead and buried? This will be buried even deeper now?
I don't know how you get to a two-state solution. We know how problematic that's been historically, and there's only far more settlers that are right now on the West Bank. It becomes harder to do every day that passes. But let's be clear. No one thought they had to deal with the Palestinian issue anymore, not in Israel, not in the Middle East, not in the United States. The Palestinian issue is now back to the top of the regional agenda, at least for the near-term future, and a lot of countries around the world, including Israel, are going to have to grapple with what that means.
Finally, how does this impact other world powers? The United States, India, China, all of them coming out strongly in support of the Israeli nation at this moment. But how does this impact, for example, America's strategy in the Middle East?
China didn't come out strongly in favor of the Israelis. In fact, at the Security Council meeting, the Chinese blamed the Israelis for the antecedent conditions that allowed this to happen. They did condemn the Palestinian attacks, of course. The Russians did not even condemn the attacks. I mean, look, there still is a lot of division around the world. I do believe that the nature of these attacks led to very widespread condemnation, including your own India. But long term, as this war grinds on, as it costs more and more lives, I think that you're going to see much greater polarization both around the world and eventually also in Israel. And that's something to watch too.
Ian Bremmer, you're terribly squeezed for time, for finding a short window for India today. Thank you very much. Deeply appreciate your insights. Thank you, sir.